My first day at the company felt like the start of a new life. I had worked hard for years to reach that moment. I remembered walking through the glass doors early that morning, holding my folder tightly while trying to calm my nerves. The office looked modern and quiet. People moved quickly through the halls, carrying laptops and coffee cups. I kept reminding myself that I belonged there. After the front desk checked me in, I was told to wait for someone from the Human Resources department. They would finish my onboarding process and show me around. A few minutes later, a man walked toward me with a wide smile. He introduced himself as the head of HR. First, everything seemed normal. He spoke confidently and welcomed me warmly. He explained company policies and asked about my previous experience. But something about the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable. His eyes stayed on me longer than necessary. I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was just nervous. After the paperwork was finished, he offered to show me around the office. We walked through several departments while he explained how the company operated. People nodded politely as we passed. Then he suggested we step into a small meeting room to discuss my role in more detail. I agreed, thinking it was part of the onboarding process. But once the door closed, the atmosphere suddenly changed. His smile became different, less professional, more personal. That was the moment I realized my first day might not go the way I expected. The meeting room felt smaller than before once the door closed behind us. I sat across from him while he leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. At first he asked normal questions about my goals and how I planned to grow in the company. I answered politely, but then the questions slowly changed. He began asking about my personal life. Was I single? Did I live alone? Did I like going out after work? Each question made me more uncomfortable. I tried to keep the conversation professional. I redirected the discussion back to work responsibilities and training plans. But he kept smiling in a strange way. Finally, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "You're going to do very well here," he said. I nodded politely. Then he added something that made my stomach tighten. "People who are close to me always move up quickly." For a moment I didn't respond. The meaning behind his words was clear. He was not talking about work performance. I took a slow breath and stayed calm. "I'm here to work hard," I said. He chuckled softly. "Work is important," he replied. "But relationships matter even more." The room suddenly felt heavy. I realized the situation had crossed a line. So I stood up slowly. "I think we've finished everything for today," I said. His smile faded slightly. But I didn't wait for another response. I walked out of the room and returned to the open office area. My heart was racing. It was only my first day. But something inside me told me this situation was far from over. For the next few days I focused on my work. I arrived early every morning and stayed busy learning the systems and procedures. My team was friendly and helpful. They showed me how to manage reports and track project progress. Working kept my mind away from the uncomfortable meeting I had with the HR manager. But he didn't disappear. Every day he found a reason to stop by my desk. Sometimes he asked about my progress. Other times he simply stood nearby and started small conversations. At first I kept things polite and professional. But I noticed something strange. He rarely spoke to anyone else the same way. His attention was always focused on me. One afternoon he walked over while I was reviewing a project report. "Working late again?" he asked. I looked up. "I'm just finishing a few things." He leaned against the desk and lowered his voice. "You don't have to work so hard to impress people," he said. I didn't answer. Then he added quietly, "There are easier ways to move forward here." The message was clear. I felt anger rising inside me. But I kept my voice calm. "I prefer earning success through my work." For a moment his smile disappeared. Then he straightened up. "Suit yourself," he said before walking away. I watched him leave. That was when I realized something important. My refusal had not ended the situation. It had only made him angry. The tension started growing after that. The HR manager stopped visiting my desk as often. But something else began happening instead. Small problems appeared around my work. Reports I submitted suddenly came back with heavy criticism. Tasks that were once simple became difficult to complete because access permissions changed. First I thought these were normal mistakes. But the pattern continued. One morning my supervisor called me into a meeting. He looked uncomfortable as he spoke. "There have been complaints about your performance," he said. My heart dropped. "Complaints?" He nodded. "Some reports were flagged as incomplete." That made no sense. I had double-checked every report before submitting them. I tried to explain, but my supervisor looked uncertain. "Just try to be more careful," he said. I left the meeting feeling confused. Later that afternoon I discovered something strange. One of my submitted reports had been edited after I turned it in. Sections of the data were missing. But I had not removed them. Someone else had. And suddenly a terrible thought crossed my mind. The person who controlled employee records and system permissions was the HR manager. The same person I had refused. That evening I stayed late at the office. Most employees had already left, and the building was quiet. I opened the system records and carefully reviewed my previous reports. Something immediately stood out. The edit timestamps. They showed changes made after my submissions. Changes made using administrative access. My heart started beating faster. Administrative access meant only a few people could modify those files. And one of them worked in the HR department. I stared at the screen for a long time. The situation suddenly felt very clear. He was trying to damage my reputation. If enough mistakes appeared under my name, it would be easy to claim I wasn't qualified for the job. The plan was simple. Make me look incompetent, then remove me from the company. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. For a moment fear tried to take control. But another feeling grew stronger. Determination. If someone wanted to push me out, they would have to work much harder. Because I wasn't going to leave quietly. Not this time. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual. The office was still quiet. Only a few lights were on, and the cleaning staff were finishing their work. I sat at my desk and opened the system again. The edits I saw the night before were still there. Someone with administrative access had removed parts of my reports after I submitted them. That explained why my supervisor thought my work was incomplete. But I needed proof. Carefully, I began saving copies of the original files from my computer. I also took screenshots of the timestamps showing when the edits were made. Each record showed the same thing. The changes happened hours after my workday ended, which meant they could not have been made by me. My heart beat faster as I gathered the evidence. For the first time I felt a small sense of control. If someone was trying to ruin my reputation, I would protect myself. Later that morning the HR manager walked past my desk. He didn't stop this time. But as he passed, he glanced at me with a small, cold smile. That look told me everything. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he believed I was powerless to stop it. But he didn't know something important. I had already started collecting the truth. Over the next week the pressure grew worse. More of my reports came back with errors. More complaints appeared about my work. My supervisor looked increasingly frustrated each time he spoke with me. "I don't understand," he said during one meeting. "You seemed capable when we hired you." I felt my chest tighten. "I am capable," I replied calmly. He sighed. "Then something needs to change." I nodded, even though I knew the real problem wasn't my work. It was someone quietly damaging it. That evening I stayed late again. I carefully compared my saved files with the ones inside the system. The differences were clear. Entire sections were missing. Numbers had been altered. Comments were deleted. And every change came from administrative access. I documented everything. Each timestamp, each file version, each edit. As I worked, a new thought entered my mind. Why was the HR manager so determined to remove me? Was it simply because I rejected him? Or was there something else he didn't want me to see? That question stayed with me as I left the office that night. Because sometimes people try to silence someone not just out of anger, but out of fear. 2 days later everything changed. That morning my supervisor called me into his office again. This time the HR manager was sitting beside him. My stomach tightened immediately. The HR manager looked calm and confident. My supervisor cleared his throat. "We've reviewed your performance," he said slowly. "And unfortunately, we've decided to terminate your employment." For a moment the words didn't feel real. Terminate. Fired. After only a few weeks, I looked at the HR manager. He avoided my eyes, but I could see a small smile on his face. "May I ask why?" said. My supervisor slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of the same reports that had been edited. "These errors are serious," he said. "They suggest carelessness with financial data." I felt anger rising, but I stayed calm. "I didn't make those changes," I said firmly. The HR manager finally spoke. "The system records show your account activity," he replied. His tone sounded smooth and confident, as if the situation was already decided. For a moment the room was silent. Then I stood up slowly. "I understand," I said. But inside something else had already begun. If they believed firing me would end the story, they were very wrong. 'Cause I already had evidence. And the truth was only beginning to surface. Leaving the building that day felt strange. Just weeks earlier I had walked in full of hope. Now I was leaving with a box of personal items and a damaged reputation. Several co-workers watched quietly as I passed. Some looked confused. Others avoided eye contact. Rumors traveled quickly in offices. By now many people probably believed I had been careless or dishonest. But I kept walking, because I knew something they didn't. The story wasn't finished. When I reached home that evening, I opened my laptop immediately. All the evidence I had collected was saved safely. Screenshots, file versions, system timestamps, proof that someone had altered my reports after submission. But something else caught my attention. While reviewing the documents again, I noticed a pattern. Several of the reports I worked on involved financial approvals, large payments, vendor accounts, contract reviews. First those details seemed ordinary. But when I looked closer, some vendor names appeared repeatedly. And strangely, they always appeared in reports connected to the HR department. My eyes narrowed. That didn't make sense. Human resources normally handled hiring and employee records, not vendor payments. A quiet feeling of suspicion grew inside me. Maybe the HR manager wasn't just trying to remove me. Maybe he was protecting something else. The next morning I decided to look deeper. Even though I no longer worked at the company, I still had copies of the reports I reviewed during my short time there. I began studying them carefully. One by one, I traced the payments linked to those unusual vendor names. The pattern quickly became clear. Every few weeks, a payment was approved for the same group of vendors. The amounts were not extremely large, but they were consistent. And over time, the total added up to a surprising number. My heart began to beat faster. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then I noticed something even stranger. Several of those payments had been approved through reports that I handled. Reports that had later been edited to look incorrect. Sudden thought struck me like lightning. What if the HR manager wasn't just trying to punish me? What if he was trying to remove the one person who might notice the fraud? I leaned back slowly in my chair. The possibility was terrifying. Because if it was true, the situation was much bigger than workplace harassment. It was fraud. And the person responsible believed he had already eliminated the only witness. But he was wrong. 'Cause I was still here. And now I was starting to see the truth. For the next 2 days I barely slept. The more I studied the reports, the clearer the pattern became. Those vendor payments were not normal. The same small group of companies kept receiving money over and over again. But when I searched for them online, almost nothing appeared. No real websites. No clear business addresses. Just empty records. That discovery made my stomach tighten. These companies might not be real. I opened the files again and checked the approval process for each payment. Almost everyone had passed through the HR department before reaching final approval. That made no sense. Human resources should not control vendor payments. Unless someone inside that department was using their access to move money quietly. I leaned back in my chair and thought about everything that had happened. The strange meeting on my first day. The pressure after I refused him. The edits to my reports. The sudden firing. All of it now looked different. He wasn't just angry. He was protecting something. Something illegal. And my reports might have been getting too close to the truth. For a long time I stared at the evidence on my screen. This situation was bigger than clearing my name. If fraud was really happening, the company was losing a lot of money. Finally I made a decision. I would not stay silent. Someone needed to know what I had discovered. The next morning I contacted a government fraud reporting office. My hands felt slightly shaky as I wrote the message. I explained everything carefully. Edited reports. The suspicious vendor payments. The access records showing administrative changes after my work hours. I attached copies of the documents I had saved. Then I read the message one last time. For a moment I hesitated. Reporting fraud against a powerful company employee could be dangerous. But the truth mattered more than fear. So I sent the message. 2 days later I received a reply. An investigator asked if I could speak with them directly. We scheduled a phone call that afternoon. During the call I explained the entire situation from the beginning. My hiring process. The uncomfortable meeting with the HR manager. The changes to my reports. The sudden termination. The investigator listened quietly. Occasionally he asked simple questions. Do you still have copies of the original reports? Yes. Do the system logs show edit timestamps? Yes. At the end of the call he paused for a moment. Then he spoke in a calm but serious voice. What you described is very concerning. My heart beat faster. We would like to investigate further. For the first time since losing my job, I felt a small sense of relief. Because now the truth was no longer only in my hands. A week later 2 investigators contacted me again. They asked if we could meet in person. We arranged to meet in a quiet office downtown. When I arrived, they were already waiting with notebooks and laptops. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. They carefully reviewed every piece of evidence I brought. Screenshots of edited reports. Copies of original files. Notes showing payment patterns to the same vendors. At one point one investigator leaned forward. These payments add up to a very large amount, he said. He nodded. That's what worried me. They continued asking questions about the company structure. Who had administrative access? Who approved financial records? Which departments interacted with vendor accounts? I explained everything as clearly as I could remember. Finally one investigator closed his notebook. We are opening a formal investigation, he said. Hearing those words sent a strange mix of relief and tension through me. The truth was finally being taken seriously. But investigations often bring attention. And attention could reach the wrong people. As I left the building that afternoon, I had the uneasy feeling that something big was about to unfold. 3 days later something unexpected happened. I received an email from the company. It asked me to attend a meeting regarding my termination. The message said new information had come to light. My first thought was that the investigators had already contacted the company. But something about the timing felt strange. Still I agreed to attend. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. When I arrived at the building, the atmosphere felt tense. Employees moved quietly through the halls. Some looked surprised to see me. Others quickly looked away. I was guided to a conference room. And sitting inside the room was the HR manager. He looked calm, but his eyes were sharp. My former supervisor sat beside him. The HR manager spoke first. We received reports that you have been contacting outside authorities, he said. My heart tightened. So he already knew. But I stayed calm. I reported suspicious activity, I replied. His smile looked thin. That was not your responsibility. I looked directly at him. Fraud is everyone's responsibility. For a moment the room went silent. Then he leaned forward slightly. "You're making a serious mistake," he said quietly. But I had already crossed that line. And there was no turning back. After that meeting I left the building again. But this time I understood something important. The HR manager was worried. If he was confronting me directly, it meant the investigation was already affecting him. Later that evening one of the investigators called. Their tone sounded serious. "We believe the fraud may involve multiple fake vendors," he explained. "That's what I suspected," I replied. "We're now reviewing financial records going back 2 years. 2 years. That meant the stolen amount could be enormous." Then he added something that surprised me. "The HR manager you mentioned has unusual access permissions." My chest tightened. "Unusual how?" "He can approve certain financial requests without secondary review." That explained everything. He had the power to move money quietly. And he had tried to remove the one person who noticed. The investigator continued speaking. "We're requesting internal system records tomorrow." For a moment I felt both nervous and hopeful. Because once those records were examined, the truth would become impossible to hide. The trap built around me was beginning to collapse. And the person who created it was running out of time. 2 days later the investigators contacted me again. Their voices sounded more serious than before. "We've reviewed the internal system records," one of them said. My heart began beating faster. "And?" "Yes. There were multiple financial approvals linked to the HR department." That didn't surprise me. But the next detail did. Most of those approvals were made through a special administrative account. I leaned forward slightly. "Who controls that account?" There was a short pause. "The HR manager." The confirmation sent a cold feeling through my chest. Everything I suspected was becoming real. The investigator continued explaining. The administrative account allowed certain financial requests to bypass normal review. In other words, money could move without many questions. That access had been used repeatedly for payments to the suspicious vendors. "Do you know how much money is involved?" "Yes." Another pause followed. "More than we expected," he replied. "Millions." For a moment I struggled to speak. Millions of dollars had been quietly transferred through fake companies. And when I started noticing irregularities, the HR manager tried to remove me. The investigator's voice became firm. "We're moving forward with the next stage of the investigation." "What does that mean?" "Yes. It means the truth is getting closer." The following week the investigation intensified. The investigators began interviewing several employees from different departments. They reviewed vendor contracts and payment records. And slowly a clearer picture began forming. The fake vendors were connected through a network of shell companies. Each one had minimal documentation, temporary addresses, no real business activity. But they all received regular payments from the company. The investigator explained something interesting during one call. "The payments were small enough to avoid attention," he said, "but frequent enough to build large totals." It was a clever system. No single payment looked suspicious. But over time the money added up to millions. Then the investigator asked me something unexpected. "Do you remember the day you were fired?" "Of course," I replied. That day included one of the largest payment approvals in the records. My chest tightened. The HR manager had fired me on the same day a major payment was processed. Suddenly the reason became obvious. He needed me gone before anyone noticed the transaction. But he underestimated something important. He thought removing me would erase the problem. Instead, it exposed the entire scheme. Few days later I received another phone call. This time the investigator sounded urgent. "We're planning to confront the HR manager tomorrow." My heart jumped. "So soon?" "Yes," he said. "We now have enough evidence to question him directly." I sat quietly for a moment. After weeks of uncertainty, the truth was finally reaching the surface. But something worried me. Does he know about the investigation? Yes. Possibly. That answer made me uneasy, because people who feel trapped sometimes react in unpredictable ways. The investigator continued speaking. We may need you to confirm certain details if necessary. I understand, I replied. After the call ended, I sat silently in my living room. The next day could change everything. If the HR manager confessed or made a mistake during questioning, the fraud case would become undeniable. But if he tried to hide the truth, the situation could become much more complicated. Either way, the moment of confrontation was coming. And the person who tried to destroy my career was about to face the consequences of his own actions. The confrontation happened inside the company headquarters. I wasn't present in the room, but the investigators later explained what happened. They arrived early that morning with financial records and system logs. The HR manager was called into a private meeting. At first he remained calm. He denied everything. He claimed the vendor payments were legitimate. But the investigators began presenting evidence one piece at a time. Administrative login records, vendor contracts, bank transfer patterns. Each document told the same story. The payments were connected. And the approvals came from his account. At one point he tried blaming accounting staff. But the system logs showed something different. Every approval used his unique administrative access. Eventually the room grew quiet, because the evidence had closed every possible escape. Then one investigator asked a simple question. Do you want to explain where the money went? For several seconds the HR manager said nothing. And in that silence, the truth finally became impossible to deny. Later that afternoon I received the call. The HR manager has been arrested, the investigator said. For a moment I couldn't move. All the tension from the past weeks suddenly lifted from my chest. Are you serious? Yes. Yes. The investigation had revealed several bank accounts connected to the fake vendors. And those accounts were secretly controlled by the HR manager. The stolen money had been transferred through multiple layers to hide the trail. But the financial records eventually led back to him. The investigator explained that the fraud had been happening for almost 3 years. Millions of dollars had disappeared slowly over time. And when my report started revealing irregular payments, the HR manager panicked. That was when he tried to remove me from the company. Framing me with edited reports seemed like the easiest solution. But his plan failed. Because the evidence remained. And the truth always leaves a trail. As I ended the call I realized something important. The person who tried to silence me had finally been exposed. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because the company still needed to face the damage. And my name still needed to be cleared publicly. News of the arrest spread through the company quickly. Even though I was no longer working there, former co-workers began contacting me. Some wanted to know if the rumors were true. Others simply wanted to apologize. For weeks many of them had believed the story that I was careless with financial reports. Now the truth was finally coming out. The investigation had uncovered years of fraud connected to the HR department. Fake vendor accounts, secret financial transfers, millions of dollars quietly disappearing. And at the center of it all was the same person who tried to force me into an uncomfortable situation on my first day. When I refused him, he didn't just become angry. He became afraid. Because my work had started uncovering the payments connected to the fake vendors. The investigators later explained something shocking. My reports had almost exposed the fraud weeks earlier. That was why the HR manager edited my files and tried to make my work look incompetent. Removing me from the company was his way of protecting the scheme. But in the end, his actions did the opposite. They exposed everything. And now the truth was beginning to reach the entire company. Several months later the case moved to court. By that time investigators had gathered overwhelming evidence. Financial records, vendor registrations, bank account connections, system login logs. Every detail confirmed the same story. The fraud had been carefully planned. Small payments were sent to fake companies again and again. Each payment looked harmless by itself. But over time the total amount grew into millions. During the trial, I was asked to explain my role in discovering the suspicious reports. Standing in the courtroom felt strange. Not long ago I had been treated like the person responsible for the fraud. Now I was explaining how the evidence was manipulated. I described how my reports were edited after submission, how administrative access changed key data, how the HR manager tried to blame me when the inconsistencies appeared. The defense tried to argue that the edits could have been mistakes. But the system logs told a different story. Every change came from the same administrative account, the same person. The judge listened carefully as the investigators presented their findings. By the end of the trial, the evidence was impossible to deny. The person who tried to frame me was finally facing the consequences. When the final verdict was announced, the courtroom felt silent. The HR manager was found guilty of fraud, identity manipulation, and financial theft. The sentence included many years in prison. For a moment I sat quietly, letting the words sink in. Months earlier my entire career had nearly collapsed. Now the truth had been confirmed in front of everyone. But the story did not end there. After the trial, several members of the company's leadership team contacted me. They asked if I would be willing to meet with them. First I felt unsure. Returning to the same company that had fired me felt strange. But curiosity finally convinced me to attend the meeting. When I arrived at the office building again, the atmosphere felt very different. Security procedures had been updated. Financial systems had been redesigned. The company was clearly trying to repair the damage caused by the fraud. Inside the meeting room, several senior leaders thanked me for helping expose the scheme. One of them said something that surprised me. Without your persistence, this fraud might have continued for years. Hearing those words felt strange after everything that had happened. But what they said next surprised me even more. The leadership team explained that the company was going through major changes. Several executives had resigned during the investigation. The previous chief executive officer had stepped down earlier that month. The company needed new leadership. People who understood the importance of honesty and accountability. One of the senior leaders looked directly at me. "We have reviewed your work history and your actions during the investigation," he said. I listened carefully. "You showed courage when it would have been easier to walk away." For a moment I didn't understand where the conversation was heading. Then he continued, "We believe you have the integrity this company needs." My heart began beating faster. "Are you asking me to return to work here?" "Yes." He smiled slightly. "In a way." The room grew quiet. "We want you to lead the company." For several seconds I could not speak. The idea sounded impossible. Only months earlier I had been fired and blamed for fraud. Now they were asking me to become the next chief executive officer. Life had taken a turn I never could have predicted. Looking back now, the entire journey still feels unbelievable. On my first day at the company, I thought I was starting a normal job. Instead I walked into a situation that almost destroyed my career. I was harassed. My work was manipulated. I was fired and blamed for mistakes I never made. For a while it felt like the truth would never be heard. But I kept asking questions. I kept searching through the numbers and reports. And slowly the truth began to reveal itself. Fake vendors. Hidden payments. A powerful person trying to protect a fraud scheme. The trap that was built for me eventually collapsed under the weight of its own lies. The person responsible was exposed. Justice was served. And my name was cleared. But the biggest surprise came afterward. Because the same company that once blamed me now trusted me to lead it. Becoming the next chief executive officer was not something I ever expected. But perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the hardest moments in life lead to the greatest opportunities. The HR manager tried to silence me. Instead, he helped reveal the truth that changed everything. And in the end, the person he tried to push out became the next CEO.